Nearly 25 years ago, two little girls vanished right under the adults' noses on an ordinary summer night at a rundown motel off I-95 in Delaware, in just a few short minutes, as if swallowed off the face of the earth. No screams, no signs of a struggle, no witnesses who saw the last child leave the hallway. All that remained was absolute silence and an empty room the families would never forget. That night kicked off a decades-long nightmare, a hopeless manhunt, dozens of suspects investigated, hundreds of leads that seemed promising only to turn into dead ends. Every clue uncovered only made the case more mysterious, as if someone was always one step ahead, a person who knew exactly how to disappear, how to erase every trace, and how to leave an entire investigation in despair. For years, Delaware was haunted by it. Detectives were rotated out, files were closed, and the case officially became one of the state's most heartbreaking cold cases. Then, more than a decade later, something strange happened. A tiny piece of evidence once dismissed as irrelevant suddenly became the key that blew the whole mystery wide open. From there, the case took turns no one saw coming, from Delaware to Washington, from a cheap motel to a dense forest, from a scrap of fabric to a federal suspect list. And when a young detective reopened the old file with eyes that refused to give up, layer after layer of the truth began to surface, dragging with it a name no one ever dared consider. Before we dive deep into this horrific case, where the smallest details fooled the entire system for 2 decades, let us know where you're watching from, and if this story already gave you chills in the first few minutes, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next parts. A July evening in 1998 in Claymont, Delaware carried the sticky heat typical of summer along the highway. The flickering neon sign of the Liberty Inn reflected off the potholed parking lot of the motel sitting along Philadelphia Pike. The White and Alvarez families had stopped for the night after a long day on the road, planning to rest just a few hours before continuing their trip the next morning. In their small first-floor room, while the adults were packing up and getting the kids ready for bed, 11-year-old Sammy White and her best friend, 9-year-old Carmen Alvarez, asked permission to go to the vending machine at the end of the hallway for snacks. The door closed behind the two girls, their small figures running past under the dim yellow lights, the sound of flip-flops echoing and fading with the distant traffic. That was the last moment the adults saw them. Just minutes later, when they didn't hear the girls return, Sammy's mom stepped out into the hallway, figuring they were just taking longer than expected choosing snacks. The hallway was dead quiet. The vending machine was still lit up but silent. She called her daughter's name, hoping for the familiar reply, but there was nothing, just the hum of the AC and the rumble of trucks on the highway. The unnatural silence put her on edge. She walked the length of the rooms and checked the back area, but the girls were nowhere. The family immediately split up to search the motel grounds, the laundry room, the smoking corner, the grassy area by the fence, the long parking lot stretching toward the main road. The front desk clerk confirmed he hadn't seen the girls pass the lobby or head out to the street during that time. A few curious guests poked their heads out into the hallway, but no one had seen anything unusual. The stairwell lights flicked on, a relative kept calling the girls' names, the shouts echoing down the corridor with no response. The family checked between parked cars, then circled behind the building and along the roadside, but there was zero sign of them. Those first minutes turned into real panic when they realized Sammy and Carmen had disappeared in an extremely short window of time inside a small confined area that didn't have many places for kids to wander without being seen. Early assumptions that the girls had run to the nearby fast food places or were playing in the yard were quickly ruled out after checking every spot and finding nothing. The atmosphere grew tense as time passed with absolutely no trace of the girls. The spontaneous search dragged on for nearly half an hour with no leads, forcing the family to accept this was no longer simple. In a state of panic, and with no other options, they immediately called 911 to report two girls, Sammy White and Carmen Alvarez, missing from the Liberty Inn, launching the case that would leave Claymont shaken for years to come. When the 911 call from the Liberty Inn came into the local dispatch, patrol units near Claymont were immediately sent to the scene. Red and blue police lights swept across the motel's front, reflecting off old oil stains in the parking lot and the row of first-floor rooms where the two families were in full panic mode. The first 3 officers on scene quickly asked everyone to step aside to avoid contaminating the area, while taking initial statements from relatives and motel staff. The fact that the girls vanished in a matter of minutes led police to treat this as an urgent case right away, because such a short disappearance window is often the key factor distinguishing a lost child from something potentially criminal. One officer walked the hallway the girls had left through, shining a flashlight along every section of wall, door edge, and the path down to the parking lot. The concrete surface was bone dry, no scuff marks, no dropped items, no drag marks from shoes. The vending machine area, the girls' intended destination, was still lit exactly as it had been when the family searched. Nothing disturbed, no wrappers or food on the floor. No one could confirm whether the girls even made it to the machine, since the motel's cameras only covered the main entrance and not the full hallway. Another team of officers searched the entire front area, parking lot, walkway to the fence, small yard, and trash area. Even though it was dark, the yard lights were working, making the ground easy to scan. What stood out most was the unnatural cleanliness. No signs of a struggle, no running footprints, no dropped personal items, no drag marks or unusual tracks leading toward the main road. For 2 scared or forcibly moved children, a scene usually leaves some accidental clues: a piece of clothing, food, a hair clip, a small toy, even skid marks from shoes. But at the Liberty Inn, none of those details existed. The oddities continued when an officer checked the area right by the fence near the parking lot. That was the route to the main street, and a way for vehicles to slip out without passing the front desk. Yet the ground showed no compression, no sudden tire marks or sharp turns. Street lights illuminated every patch, but nothing indicated unusual activity at the time the girls vanished. Police also checked behind the building, where the laundry room and maintenance equipment were kept. Kids sometimes wander to those spots out of curiosity, but every corner was empty. No doors had been forced, no sounds came from inside. The night maintenance worker confirmed he hadn't seen the girls pass by since his shift started. Another critical point noted: no one in the motel remembered seeing the girls anywhere after they stepped out of the room. No one heard running feet. No one saw them in the yard or near the road. No guest recalled the girls walking past their door. This made the disappearance zone bizarrely unclear, because even in a small motel, the layout wasn't complicated to monitor. When police asked the family for the exact time the girls left the room, and when they realized they were gone, the gap was only 3 to 5 minutes. That window was too short for 2 kids to leave the property on their own without being spotted, and too short for a stranger to approach, subdue, and remove them without leaving evidence. The initial assessment clearly stated: incident occurred in an extremely short time frame, scene unusually clean, no clear physical evidence. Officers kept sweeping the hallway, stairs, fence line, backyard, even the tall bushes near the lot. Nothing helped shape a direction for the investigation. The only thing everyone agreed on: Sammy and Carmen's disappearance did not fit the profile of ordinary lost children. From the suddenness, the brevity of time, to a scene devoid of even the tiniest clue, every factor told the officers at the Liberty Inn that night that this was anything but simple, and the next hours of response would be decisive. With the area around the Liberty Inn temporarily secured, and the initial scene survey complete, the next step was gathering statements from everyone present at the motel when Sammy and Carmen disappeared. In a small, steady traffic place like the Liberty Inn, police expected at least one witness who saw the girls leave the hallway or noticed anything odd. Yet within less than an hour of interviews, things got complicated. The statements didn't line up, and even contradicted each other to the point that establishing a clear investigative path was nearly impossible. A married couple 3 doors down said they saw 2 kids walk past their room in the hallway, but couldn't say for sure which girl was in front, or which way they turned at the end of the corridor. They only remembered the yellow hallway lights and the sound of flip-flops, but couldn't confirm whether the girls reached the vending machine or turned toward the parking lot. Their timing didn't match either. The husband said a few minutes after the girls left the room, while the wife thought it was later. Another witness, a middle-aged man in a room near the trash area, said he had a feeling he saw 2 small figures run toward the far end of the parking lot and disappear behind the row of parked trucks near the fence. But when pressed, he admitted he wasn't sure those figures were actually Sammy and Carmen, or just some other kids he glimpsed earlier in the evening. That vagueness made his statement unusable as solid evidence. In the same wing, a young woman said she heard noises like kids running, but didn't see anyone. The time she heard the sounds didn't match the family's report, and when questioned further, she admitted the noise could have come from upstairs rather than the first-floor hallway. Police had to log it as unable to confirm. Another lead appeared when a guest claimed he saw a dark-colored car driving slowly around the parking lot, seemingly watching the hallway area. But when officers asked for specifics, all he could recall was that it was big black or dark green, and he wasn't sure if it was an SUV, minivan or pickup. Another witness thought he saw a brown or light gold car pulling out of the lot around the same time the girls vanished. Both descriptions were too vague and contradictory for police to use to determine direction or suspect vehicle. A crucial point: not a single witness claimed to be the last person to see the girls leave the Liberty Inn property. Every statement stopped at maybe saw shadows, heard running, or glimpsed something. No one could pin down an exact time, direction, or clear description of the girls at the critical moment. This made it extremely difficult to establish the last confirmed sighting, the very first and most vital step in any child missing persons case. The contradictions grew when even the 2 motel employees gave differing accounts. One said he never saw the girls pass the front desk area, while the other thought he might have seen kids run by but wasn't sure when. Whether the girls even headed toward the main road remained unknown, since the front of the motel had heavy traffic and visibility wasn't total. These scattered statements showed police they couldn't rely on witness sightlines to reconstruct the children's movements. Instead, they had to lean harder on finding physical evidence, something that was becoming nearly impossible, because the scene was practically sterile. In most missing child cases, at least one witness can usually confirm the final direction or moment the child was seen. But at the Liberty Inn, every account from adults, staff and guests just circled in ambiguity. By the end of the first round of interviews near midnight, police realized they were dealing with an unusual case: 2 children vanishing from a small space in an incredibly short time, with no one able to accurately describe where they went after leaving the room. That put a huge question mark over the entire initial sequence of events, and made setting the next investigative steps far harder than in a typical disappearance. Immediately after all the statements collected from guests and employees at the Liberty Inn revealed major contradictions and no one could pinpoint the last confirmed sighting of Sammy and Carmen, police shifted to an urgent step: a nighttime search of the entire motel grounds. Patrol car lights, temporary floodlights, and reinforced manpower quickly covered the area. One of the first efforts was deploying the K-9 unit to track the scent of the 2 children from the first-floor hallway, which was considered the last confirmed location of their presence. However, unlike many other missing child cases, the scent trail of both children vanished almost immediately. The dogs only managed to follow it a very short distance toward the parking lot before becoming confused and disoriented. This indicated that the scent had likely been disrupted by the large number of people who had walked through the area before police secured the scene, or the 2 children had been removed in a way that left no clear trail. At the same time, the crime scene continued to be compromised by the heavy foot traffic that occurred before police arrived. Family members, motel guests, and staff had unintentionally trampled many areas that might have contained critical evidence. The parking lot and walkways, already small, were now a jumble of fresh and old footprints, making it impossible for investigators to distinguish which belonged to children and which to adults. One officer had initially spotted a small shoe print near the fence, but during processing, the print was completely ruined due to the incorrect use of cleaning solution, causing the edges to smear and rendering it legally useless. This was one of the biggest losses in the early stage of the investigation, as that print might have been the only clue to their direction of movement. Beyond the hallway and parking lot, police expanded the search to adjacent areas: the backyard, laundry room, maintenance shed, and the path leading to the main road. All were checked multiple times under powerful lights, but no items that could belong to the two children were found. No dropped snack bags, no hair clips, no small pieces of fabric, and no signs of struggle or resistance. The cleanliness of the scene became a major red flag. Panicked, restrained, or coerced children almost always leave at least some minor trace, yet the Liberty Inn had none. While sweeping the walkway along the fence, police hoped to find evidence based on a witness who claimed to have seen two small figures. However, the ground there had already been heavily trampled during the initial search phase, leaving no discernible prints. Any soft soil marks could belong to dozens of different people and could not be isolated as children's footprints. This forced police to consider the possibility that the witness statement was simply a mistake under poor lighting conditions. In the front area of the motel, search teams meticulously covered every square meter from the base of the stairs, along the room rows, all the way to the main road. If the two children had walked out on their own, it would have been very difficult for no one to notice, since the entrance and exit were within view of many rooms. Yet no one remembered seeing Sammy or Carmen anywhere, and no one heard running, talking, or any unusual sounds. This led police to lean toward the theory that if the children left the premises, it happened silently. For example, being carried or placed into a vehicle very quickly. Along the roadside areas, officers swept flashlights over sidewalks, grass patches, utility poles, and drainage ditches, but still found no indication the children had passed through. The road leading to the highway was wide and heavily traveled, yet the ground showed no drag marks or soil disturbances consistent with the weight of small children. By the time the search had stretched on for many hours, and the entire area around the Liberty Inn had been checked at least twice, police had to make a preliminary assessment. They could not determine how the two children left the motel grounds, or even whether they had left on foot at all. The absence of a starting point suggested the disappearance occurred within an extremely narrow time window, with an unusual level of cleanliness that was inconsistent with children wandering off on their own. This was the first clear sign to investigators that the case was far more complex than a typical child wandering scenario. Once the entire Liberty Inn area had been searched multiple times with no trace of Sammy or Carmen, police realized that confining the search to the motel grounds was no longer effective. Claymont's location right next to the major I-95 corridor and the Amtrak rail line made it realistically possible for the children to have been removed from the area in a very short time. Therefore, starting early the next morning, the search was expanded in three main directions: the Amtrak rail line, the wooded area along the highway, and the I-95 on and off ramps. The first direction was the Amtrak rail line, not far from the motel, and considered a quick escape route for anyone wanting to leave without passing the front desk or main road. Along the tracks were thick bushes, open patches of ground, and some unlit sections. Search teams walked the line, carefully checking every crevice, tree base, and water channel for signs the children had passed through. They recovered several children's items: a sandal, a plastic ball, broken toy pieces, but when cross-checked with the family, none belonged to Sammy or Carmen. This made the search harder, because the rail corridor was already littered with trash and children's items from prior activity. Next, teams were sent into the wooded area along the highway, just minutes by car from the Liberty Inn. This was more complex terrain, numerous small trails, vision-blocking brush, damp soil that could hold prints but was also easily disturbed by people or animals. Flashlights sweeping the dark pockets of the woods revealed no clear signs. More children's items kept turning up: a small glove, food wrappers, plastic toy fragments, but again, all were unrelated to the two missing children. This created a noise problem with evidence. Every seemingly significant find was immediately ruled out after verification. From the air, helicopters assisted by sweeping the woods and open land along the highway. From altitude, police hoped to spot unusual movement or improperly parked vehicles, but the spotlight revealed nothing noteworthy. No signs of struggle, no children's clothing, no bright colors standing out against the ground. Every suspicious area was thoroughly ground-checked, but yielded no investigative leads. Attention then shifted to the I-95 ramp system. This highway allowed a vehicle to leave Delaware in minutes, and if a perpetrator had a car waiting, the children could have been far from Claymont before the family even realized they were gone. Police contacted toll booths, rest stops, roadside stores, and highway patrol posts in neighboring states, asking for reports of children seen with strangers during the relevant time frame. However, the lack of specific vehicle description, license plate, or suspect details made every request too vague. No reports came back solid enough to use as a lead. Meanwhile, tips from the public began pouring in. Some claimed to have seen the children in a nearby neighborhood, but security cameras showed no children passing through. Another said they saw two kids near the edge of the woods, but the description of appearance and clothing didn't match Sammy and Carmen. Many calls were just rumors, forcing police to check unrelated locations. These false reports spread resources thin and slowed progress on higher priority directions. Police also canvassed the residential area between the Liberty Inn and the I-95 ramps. It contained many small side streets and shortcuts a suspect could use to avoid attention. However, no residents reported seeing the children, and no one recalled kids wandering the area at that time. Every effort to follow a trail ended in nothing. When all teams returned to the staging area at the end of the day, the search map covered many kilometers in multiple checked layers, yet the conclusion mirrored the previous night. No evidence Sammy or Carmen had ever appeared in the expanded zones. This left two possibilities. Either the children never left the motel grounds by any of the routes police had checked, or they were removed by vehicle immediately, before search teams had a chance to collect traces. The final result of the expanded search was zero. No evidence, no direction of travel, no victim belongings. Despite widening the net to the Amtrak tracks, the woods along I-95, and the highway ramp system, police still had no concrete investigative direction to pursue the perpetrator or locate the children. The situation was becoming alarming as time passed with absolutely no new leads emerging. With the expanded searches around the Liberty Inn and along the I-95 corridor yielding no leads whatsoever, investigators were forced to circle back to the few scraps recorded in the initial statements. Among them, the repeated but still very vague description of a large, dark-colored vehicle, possibly a van, stood out more than anything else. With no clearer direction, police began checking vehicles in the neighborhoods around Claymont for vans matching that loose description. The first coincidence emerged when they discovered a man living near the Liberty Inn. Hank Morris owned an older brown van, whose shape roughly matched the vague witness accounts. At that exact moment, a motel witness claimed in a lineup that he was almost certain he had seen a man resembling Hank driving a van through the parking lot around the time Sammy and Carmen disappeared. That statement, though based on imperfect memory, was enough, in a case where police had zero other leads, to make Hank the primary person of interest. He was immediately brought in for questioning. Hank was cooperative, remained calm, and said he had been home alone that evening. Living alone, however, meant he had no one to confirm his alibi. This forced police to proceed cautiously and examine his vehicle. The van was towed to the forensic bay, where the entire interior, seats, floor, rear cargo area, and trunk, was processed with alternate light sources and specialized chemicals for blood, fibers, or foreign fingerprints. The results came back completely clean. No blood, no fabric fibers matching children's clothing sizes, no fingerprints except Hank's own. A few tiny fibers found on the carpet were analyzed and turned out to be from the van's own mats and Hank's clothing, nothing related to the disappearance. Hank's home was also thoroughly searched. The small house where he lived alone showed no unusual signs, no small children's shoe prints, no suspicious stains, no items suggesting contact with or confinement of children. Everything was consistent with his initial statement that he never left home that evening. Neighbors confirmed they noticed nothing odd involving Hank that night. What consumed the most investigative effort, however, was the witness who had identified Hank in the lineup. When pressed for more detail about the man he believed he saw, the witness grew uncertain. The parking lot lighting had been poor, the distance considerable, and many hours had passed. All these factors eroded the accuracy of his memory. When asked to describe specifics, clothing, color, height, facial features, the witness couldn't provide answers. The deeper police probed, the clearer it became that the identification was far less reliable than initially hoped. Nevertheless, clearing Henry Morris took nearly a full week. Investigators had to check his background, map possible routes from his home, review nearby traffic cameras, re-interview neighbors, and cross-reference every detail related to the van. During this period, other investigative avenues were significantly delayed. Search teams had to be pulled to assist with forensic support, slowing down wider area sweeps. When the final forensic reports and behavioral analysis came back, all suspicion against Hank collapsed completely. No physical trace, no evidence of contact with children, no matching shoe prints or fibers, and the original witness identification was re-evaluated as unreliable. After eliminating every point of suspicion, police officially cleared Hank from the suspect list. The consequences of this misdirection were clear. While focused on Hank, police lost many critical hours that could have been used to strengthen other lines of inquiry. The coincidence of the brown van, based only on scattered and inaccurate descriptions, had caused investigators to invest far too much time in a dead end. A disappearance that already had almost no leads was now at risk of stalling even earlier than expected. When Hank was fully cleared, the file noted the final conclusion: no forensic evidence, no suspicious behavior, no connection to the missing children. And while excluding an innocent person was necessary, investigators also knew that a significant amount of time had been wasted on a false trail. This forced them to completely rethink their initial strategy in order to keep searching for an answer to the mysterious disappearance of Sammy and Carmen. 17 months after Sammy White and Carmen Alvarez vanished from the Liberty Inn, the case was on the verge of going completely cold. Every previous investigative lead, from the brown van to the search zones along I-95, had produced nothing solid enough to move the file forward. The prolonged silence had pushed the case into a holding pattern, until one autumn morning, when a hunter entered Blackbird State Forest, the vast wooded area south of New Castle County, to prepare for deer season. While following a rarely used trail, the hunter spotted something white protruding from the layer of decayed leaves. Thinking it was animal bone, he almost walked past it, but the shape was too uniform and the location too odd. When he bent down for a closer look, he realized the structure resembled human bone. He immediately called the police. The forensic team arrived quickly and needed only minutes to determine that the first skeleton belonged to a child. Recognizing the possible connection to the 1998 missing persons case, they expanded the search radius. Soon afterward, a second set of remains was located about 30 meters from the first. That distance immediately raised eyebrows. Child victims are typically found close together if they died at the same spot. The separation suggested two possibilities. Either animals had dragged the bones apart, or the bodies had been placed in two separate locations from the start. Both theories were noted for later analysis. Near the first skeleton, forensics recovered a frayed red fabric fragment, soiled and buried deep in the leaf litter. Since it couldn't immediately be linked to either victim or ruled out as random debris, the item was carefully sealed. Several other loose fibers of inconsistent colors and textures were collected near the second skeleton and bagged for testing. During preliminary bone reassembly, the team noticed a clean, sharp, precise cut on one of the long bones that did not match animal teeth marks or tearing. This was a significant anomaly. Though the cause couldn't yet be determined, the cut was documented as potential evidence of a sharp tool used either before or after death. After all remaining bones were collected and transported to the lab, the identification process began. Based on bone length, epiphyseal development, and cranial features, both victims were determined to be pre-teen, matching the ages of Sammy and Carmen at the time of their disappearance. Dental records and skeletal characteristics quickly confirmed their identities. The case instantly shifted back into active homicide investigation mode. One of the critical steps was establishing time of death. Analysis of decomposition stage, adhering soil samples, and insect evidence showed both victims died very close to the time they went missing, essentially on or immediately after the day they left the Liberty Inn. This ruled out any theory that the children had survived for an extended period after their disappearance. Police determined the forest location showed no clear signs the bodies had been buried. Instead, it appeared highly likely they had been placed directly on the surface and left there. If true, that meant the perpetrator drove the victims to a fairly remote spot, stopped only briefly, and left without creating obvious traces. Further examination of the surrounding area yielded almost no new evidence. The forest was too large and too much time had passed for traces to remain. But three standout items, the red fabric fragment, the assorted fibers, and the clean cut on the bone, immediately became the first meaningful leads after more than a year of stalled investigation. From this point, the Sammy and Carmen case officially shifted from a directionless missing persons investigation to a murder case requiring clarification of circumstances, motive, and perpetrator. More importantly, the evidence recovered at Blackbird State Forest would become the foundation for the next phase of forensic analysis. Discovering the remains of Sammy White and Carmen Alvarez in Blackbird State Forest confirmed the tragedy, but provided no clear progress in identifying the killer. When the forensic team completed its initial analysis and sent the report to investigators, the crime scene picture revealed an alarming scarcity of physical evidence. After more than a year exposed in the woods, no usable DNA remained. All soft tissue had completely decomposed. Any clothing, if it ever existed, had been destroyed by the elements or wildlife. The red fabric fragment and collected fibers contained no cells sufficient for testing and carried no biological traces that could be matched. This rendered the most powerful forensic tool of the late 1990s, DNA analysis, completely useless in this case. The problem grew worse when examiners found no murder weapon or marks that could be tied to a specific tool. The clean cut on one long bone was unusual, but it stood alone and revealed nothing about what made it. Without soft tissue, tool mark residue, or stable ground surfaces around the scene, the cut, though strange, was insufficient to build a clear scenario. Meanwhile, the original witnesses at the Liberty Inn became a major liability. Statements taken the night of the disappearance were already contradictory. Some saw a dark-colored vehicle, others saw a small figure running. Still others recalled a woman walking by, and months later, their memories had only grown fuzzier. No witness could definitively say who last saw Sammy and Carmen leave the hallway. No one provided a clear description of a stranger, a vehicle, or anything suspicious. The absence of reliable witnesses prevented investigators from cross-referencing or narrowing suspects. The evidence collected in the forest also failed to generate leads. The red fabric, did not come from the victim's clothing. The assorted fibers were scattered and inconsistent, making it impossible to prove they were related to the crime. The distance between the skeletons was odd but inconclusive. Animal scattering or intentional separation, neither could be proven. Nothing directly linked the children to a specific individual, and nothing was distinctive enough to serve as a solid lead. Even the dump site itself offered no additional clues. There were no tire tracks to identify a vehicle type. No footprints survived the long decomposition period. No personal items left by the perpetrator. Every potential marker had been erased by time, weather, and animals. Faced with these limitations, the investigative team had to reassess the viability of continuing an active pursuit. No DNA, no weapon, no witnesses, no crime scene pattern, no distinctive evidence. Every avenue led to the same conclusion: the case had no remaining proactive leads. Earlier efforts, including chasing suspect Hank Morris and searching along the I-95 corridor, had produced nothing. In late 2000 case review meetings, the supervising detective made the difficult but necessary call: temporarily close the file and transfer it to the cold case unit. Once classified as a cold case, it wasn't abandoned. It was archived so that future forensic advances, new federal databases, or fresh tips could potentially revive it. Delaware's cold case unit would monitor and re-evaluate when warranted. This change in status reflected the real limitations of investigative capabilities at the time. Every available forensic tool had been exhausted, every possible witness interviewed, every related area searched. There was simply no strong piece left to reconnect the story behind Sammy and Carmen's deaths. Like many trace evidence-poor cases of the 1990s, their file, now cold case #128, was placed in long-term state storage, awaiting a breakthrough no one at the time could predict. 12 years after the Sammy White and Carmen Alvarez file was shelved as cold case #128C, it sat untouched under a thick layer of dust. That changed in 2010 when Delaware launched a program to re-examine backlog cases using new forensic technology, and this file made the priority list. It was assigned to Detective Elena Mercer, a 34-year-old investigator known in the unit for doggedly dissecting cases others had given up on. On her first day with the file, Elena read every summary, scene report, bone analysis, witness statement, and evidence log. She immediately saw the constraints: no DNA, no weapon, no preserved traces, very little evidence, most of it unlinked to the victims. Yet what caught her attention most were the overlooked details from 1998, 2000, especially the red fabric fragment found near the first skeleton. Old records noted the fragment did not belong to Sammy or Carmen, contained no DNA, no skin cells, no blood, causing it to be downgraded as unimportant. To Elena, that made it interesting. If it wasn't the victims, why was it right next to the body? And why was there no clear explanation in the file? She requested the cold case unit pull the entire evidence box and re-examine everything with 2010 forensic technology, which was light years ahead of 1998, 2000 capabilities. The red fragment was examined under a new generation scanning electron microscope, revealing it was woven from a nylon acrylic blend used in certain late 1990s athletic jackets, but uncommon in Delaware. That opened the possibility the perpetrator came from out of state or traveled widely. Next, Elena ordered retesting of the loose fibers from near the second skeleton. This time the lab identified several dark blue polyester fibers that did not match the victim's clothing and had not appeared in any other samples. Crucially, their degradation rate, structure, and weave strongly suggested they came from adult clothing, not random debris. Thanks to newer techniques, Elena realized the two previously dismissed items could actually be trace evidence from the perpetrator's clothing, a line of inquiry the original investigators simply lacked the tools to pursue. Beyond physical evidence, Elena decided to revisit the 1998 security camera footage, originally deemed useless because of noise, frame drops, and blurriness. She sent the original analog tapes to the department's signal restoration unit. After more than a week, the results came back striking. In one segment previously labeled, "Nothing of value," a clear adult figure, wearing a dark jacket, could be seen standing near the hallway area, right before Sammy and Carmen left their room to buy snacks. The camera was too blurry for facial details, but this person's presence did not match any witness statement. No one had recalled seeing a stranger in that spot. Another partially corrupted tape showed a large vehicle stopped at the edge of the frame for a few seconds. Color and plates were unreadable, but the silhouette matched the dark van or SUV. Some 1998 witnesses had vaguely described, though not direct proof, it was the first data in years suggesting an unrecorded vehicle may have been present. Elena began reconstructing the timeline. The perpetrator may have been near the victim's room before the children stepped out. The perpetrator may have been wearing clothing containing red nylon, acrylic and dark blue polyester fibers. A large vehicle may have been waiting in the Liberty Inn parking lot. This individual was likely not a registered guest, since no one remembered him. These details were not enough to identify a suspect, but they aligned in ways the old file had never recognized. The evidence, restored video, and the children's disappearance window all pointed to a previously unknown person. In hindsight, Elena understood the 1998 investigators hadn't been wrong. They had simply been handcuffed by the technology of their era. But 2010 was different. A tiny fiber, or a blurry shadow, now had the potential to become a major lead. After compiling the new forensic reports, restored images, and related analyses, Elena submitted a formal request to the Cold Case Unit commander to reopen the Sammy White and Carmen Alvarez investigation. The request was approved within 48 hours. For the first time in 12 years, Cold Case #128C was moving again, and it all revolved around three items once considered worthless: the red fabric fragment, the dark blue polyester fibers, and the mysterious figure standing outside the Liberty Inn hallway in 1998. When the Cold Case Unit officially reopened the Sammy White and Carmen Alvarez files, Detective Elena Mercer began expanding the scope of her analysis beyond Delaware. The one thing in the entire case file that grabbed her attention more than anything else, and the first clue that this might not be a single-state crime, was the red fabric scrap. It didn't belong to the victims, wasn't attached to anything the girls owned, and its fiber composition, nylon blended with acrylic, was rare on the East Coast in the late 1990s. Elena submitted the fabric to the VICAP system for comparison with violent child cases across the United States. Her goal wasn't DNA, there was none on the scrap, but a match in material type, weave pattern and appearance. That kind of comparison rarely yields results. Yet just 2 weeks later, the federal lab sent back a report. A 1997 case in Seattle had an evidence item with an uncanny match. Elena could hardly believe her eyes. The report stated that in a disappearance murder of 2 young girls on the outskirts of Seattle, Washington State Police had recovered a nearly identical red fabric scrap near Blackbird State Forest. Both pieces shared the same nylon, acrylic ratio, the same twisted fiber weave, the same spiral tear pattern, and the same signs of being violently ripped from a thin athletic jacket. The similarity could not be dismissed as coincidence. Elena immediately requested the full 1997 Seattle file be transferred to Delaware. As soon as she opened it, the parallels jumped out. Victims were 2 young girls, abducted from cheap motels, roadside inns, vanished in an extremely short window. Bodies found in remote wooded areas far from the abduction site. The only notable physical evidence was fabric fibers that didn't belong to the victims. On top of that, the Seattle forensic report noted the presence of dark blue polyester fibers, the exact same fibers Elena had just discovered during the 2010 re-examination of the Delaware case. 2 crimes a year apart, on opposite sides of the country, producing nearly identical stray fibers, forced Elena to seriously consider an interstate offender. Digging deeper, she found one detail that gave her chills. The red scrap in Seattle had also been found just a few steps from the bodies, exactly the same layout as in Delaware. That could not be random. Elena began reconstructing the behavioral pattern from the two cases. The offender targets low-cost lodging where children often wander outside unnoticed by adults, acts extremely fast, seizing the moment when no witnesses are present, leaves no major trace evidence, indicating experience or careful planning, uses remote forest as a dump site, secluded and hard to track, leaves behind fabric scraps and fibers from his own clothing, likely torn off while restraining or carrying the victims. Taken together, these patterns suggested the offender was not an impulsive criminal, but someone with a repeating modus operandi, experienced at concealment, and able to exploit extremely narrow time windows. Furthermore, Elena realized the evidence in both cases shared the same characteristic fabric from athletic jackets that did not belong to the victims. That fit the clothing profile of interstate truckers, long-haul workers, or individuals who regularly traveled through cold states jobs or routes that would place the offender in multiple states. When Elena re-examined the restored Liberty Inn surveillance footage, her conviction grew that the cases were linked. The adult figure in a dark jacket, standing in the hallway right before Sammy and Carmen vanished, matched descriptions from Seattle, where 1997 motel cameras had also captured a similar shadowy figure near the outdoor stairs. Faces weren't visible, but posture, positioning, and timing all pointed to a pattern. The offender watched the victims immediately before abducting them. Another detail aligned: the large dark vehicle. In Seattle, a witness described a van or SUV leaving the motel around the time the girls disappeared. In Delaware, the blurry camera caught the outline of a large vehicle at the edge of the parking lot. No clear plates in either case, but it was one of the few points where the Seattle and Delaware files looked almost like mirror images. Elena cross-referenced timelines: Seattle fall 1997, Delaware summer 1998, only a year apart, close enough for a repeating offender, but not so frequent as to attract immediate attention. Typical of mobile predators who strike only when conditions are right during their travels. They commit the crime when opportunity and lack of supervision align, then disappear before anyone can identify them. From all the data, Elena drafted an analysis for the FBI. The report highlighted 3 pillars: 1 physical evidence match, red fabric scrap, dark blue polyester fibers, tear pattern, fiber structure; 2 behavioral pattern match, cheap motel, children in hallway, disappearance within minutes, forest dump site, no DNA; 3 peripheral signature match, shadowy figure in dark jacket, large dark vehicle. At the end of the report, Elena wrote, "High probability that the 1997 Seattle case and the 1998 Delaware case are linked to the same offender. Recommend opening federal cooperation." With that closing sentence, the Sammy White and Carmen Alvarez case entered an entirely new phase, no longer an isolated cold case, but one piece of a cross-country crime series left behind by a nomadic predator whose only consistent trace was stray fibers. After linking the 1998 Delaware case to the 1997 Seattle case through textile evidence, Detective Elena Mercer knew the next step was to identify individuals with interstate travel patterns who had been near budget motels between 1996 and 1999. The FBI sent back a list of nearly 20 names, but only one made Elena freeze: Joseph Edward Duncan III. Duncan had never appeared in the original 1998 Delaware files, and no witness had ever mentioned him. But in the 1997 Seattle file, his name had been listed as a potential suspect, later cleared for lack of direct evidence. At that time, Duncan was living temporarily in Spokane, working as a mobile equipment repairman, and traveling constantly. Elena immediately saw how that fit the profile of an offender, with wide non-fixed travel routes. She began pulling lodging records within a 20-mile radius of Claymont for the week Sammy and Carmen vanished. The 1998 records were fragmented and incomplete, but eventually Elena located a registration at a small Wilmington motel, a room rented under the name J. Duncan. Paid in cash, vehicle registered in Washington state. That single piece of information felt like the first direct thread to a suspect. For verification, she turned to a resource the original investigators had never used: Delaware 1998 traffic camera footage, since digitized by the FBI's National Recovery Program. Elena requested a scan of all cameras within the time window of the girl's disappearance near Liberty Inn. Most images were blurry, but at 9:47 p.m. on Philadelphia Pike, a large dark vehicle passed through frame. The plate was only partially visible, but the FBI lab applied image restoration algorithms, enhancing contrast and reducing noise. After more than a day of processing, the result showed the first 4 characters of the plate matched the plate registered to Joseph Edward Duncan III's minivan at that time. Pieces began falling into place rapidly. Duncan was in Seattle at the exact time of the 1997 case. He was in Wilmington the exact week the girls disappeared. His vehicle matched the shadow recorded near Liberty Inn. Both cases had the red fabric and dark blue polyester fibers. Both crime scenes were budget motels. Both dump sites were remote forests. For further confirmation, Elena pulled 1998 traffic stop logs, records police patrol officers kept of random vehicle checks. Such data was rarely considered important in homicide investigations, but Elena wanted certainty. After hours combing scanned old files, she found an entry dated July 10, 1998, just 2 weeks after Sammy and Carmen vanished. Dark-colored minivan, WA plates, stopped on Route 13. Driver Joseph Duncan. Paperwork in order. The short note was critical. Duncan had been driving that exact vehicle in Delaware near the time of the crime. The report also noted he appeared tired and nervous, but since there was no violation, he was released. Elena then accessed Duncan's employment history and discovered he had held numerous short-term contract jobs, requiring constant travel across western and eastern states. That profile perfectly matched the offender she was building, someone who frequently changed work locations, rarely stayed long in one place, and could easily blend into budget motel environments. Putting it all together, Elena realized every piece of data, from physical evidence, surveillance footage, lodging records, to traffic logs, converged on one individual. No other name on the FBI list was present in both states at both critical times. No one else had a matching vehicle or travel history. Elena wrote a lengthy report to the cold case unit leadership. In it she outlined Duncan's presence in Wilmington, coinciding with the week of the abduction. Duncan's vehicle matching the shadow on camera. Fabric evidence from both scenes consistent with clothing Duncan had been photographed wearing. His travel history matching an interstate offender pattern. Prior record in Washington, involving child assault, though never convicted at the level of the 1997 and 1998 cases. Her final conclusion read, Joseph Edward Duncan III
is the suspect who best fits both crime scenes.
All new data indicate a very high probability that he is the perpetrator. Within less than 24 hours of reading the report, the FBI formally took over the file and opened a special federal investigation. For the first time since 1998, the name Joseph Edward Duncan III was no longer an open question in the Delaware girls' case. It became the center of a decade-plus nationwide manhunt. Once the tracing placed Joseph Edward Duncan III as the prime suspect, Detective Elena Mercer knew the next step was a federal-level behavioral evaluation. Technical data could prove Duncan's presence in Delaware, but only behavioral analysis could determine how closely he matched the Liberty Inn 1998 attack pattern. If his known modus operandi aligned at a high percentage with the Sammy and Carmen case, it would solidify him as the sole viable suspect. Elena worked directly with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit (BAU) and gained access to Duncan's full behavioral file, travel history, prior suspected offenses, psychological notes, and attack patterns from cases he had been investigated for. From the very first round of analysis, the degree of overlap was striking. 92% of the Delaware attack pattern matched Duncan's established profile. The clearest and most obvious factor was victim selection. Duncan consistently targeted children aged 6–13, primarily those traveling with family, but briefly separated from adult supervision. Sammy 11 and Carmen 9 fit perfectly into both the age range and situational profile Duncan favored. This wasn't mere coincidence, it was a recognized signature in Duncan's behavior documented across cases in Washington, Idaho, and Minnesota. The next factor was speed of action. Duncan typically struck extremely fast, exploiting the exact moment a child was isolated, stepping out of a room, out of a car, or into an empty area for just minutes. The Delaware file was explicit. Sammy and Carmen left their room around 9:44 p.m. and were gone within less than 5 minutes. That time frame matched Duncan's documented instant opportunity pattern perfectly. The third critical point was crime scene environment. Duncan had a history of choosing budget motels, roadside inns, or locations with minimal security. Liberty Inn fit the description exactly. Outdated cameras, dim hallways, constant guest turnover, allowing an offender to blend in unnoticed. The BAU rated this environmental match at 90%. Next, the dump site, the body disposal location, was one of the strongest behavioral indicators. Duncan typically took victims to deep forest, isolated trails, areas near highways for quick access but low discovery risk, and left bodies on the surface rather than buried. Blackbird State Forest met every criterion. The distance between the two sets of remains, and the state of decomposition, also aligned with patterns the FBI had documented in Duncan's other cases. This similarity was rated near absolute match. Another key factor: trace evidence. Duncan rarely left victim belongings, but frequently left behind clothing fibers from his own garments, jacket pieces torn during restraint, synthetic fibers from athletic or utility clothing he commonly wore. That was precisely what was recovered in both the 1997 Seattle and 1998 Delaware cases: red nylon, acrylic fabric scrap, dark blue polyester fibers, matching tear patterns, none belonging to the victims. The fact that two cases on opposite coasts produced identical stray fabric pushed the BAU's behavioral trace match score to 95%. The sixth factor was the vehicle. Duncan consistently used dark-colored minivans, large SUVs, or long-term rentals from small agencies. Restored Liberty Inn footage showed a large dark vehicle appearing exactly when the girls vanished. Subsequent traffic cam confirmation matched 4 plate characters to Duncan's registered minivan. This fit his documented interstate travel pattern. Another factor that dramatically raised the match percentage was his habit of lingering near the scene before striking. Duncan typically approached the area the child would pass through, observed from a distance without drawing attention, then acted the moment supervision lapsed. In Seattle, cameras captured a dark-jacketed figure near the stairs before the victims disappeared. In Delaware, restored footage showed a dark-jacketed figure in the exact spot Sammy and Carmen walked past. The BAU scored Duncan's approach, observe, strike pattern match at 96%. Finally, the offending cycle. Duncan did not strike in rapid succession, but followed psychological cycles, typically 9–18 months apart. The Seattle 1997 and Delaware 1998 cases were exactly 12 months apart, falling in the middle of his documented average cycle. When all data was aggregated, the BAU issued its final estimate: behavioral similarity between Duncan and the Delaware offender 92%, an extremely high score in interstate crime analysis. The BAU conclusion sent back to the cold case unit and FBI read: based on behavior, attack pattern, physical evidence, and time location data, Joseph Edward Duncan III is the only suspect fitting at a high probability level. With this analysis, Duncan officially became suspect number 1, entering a deeper phase of federal investigation to locate the final evidence needed for prosecution. After analyzing the behavioral patterns and confirming a 92% match between Joseph Edward Duncan III's attack model and the 1998 Delaware case, Detective Elena Mercer moved on to the hardest part, finding physical evidence strong enough to tie Duncan to the Blackbird State Forest crime scene. This was the part every investigator knew would decide whether the case could finally be closed. For years, what had kept the Delaware case from becoming a prosecution was the absence of DNA and the lack of any direct physical evidence linking the perpetrator. However, during the 2010 forensic re-examination, one detail that had been noted but never deeply pursued suddenly became the golden clue: a clean, sharp cut on one of the victim's long bones. From the very first reread of the file, Elena had zeroed in on that note. Most of the bone trauma on the children at the forest dump site consisted of tears, fractures caused by animals, or natural impact damage. But the cut documented in the original 1999 report was clean, precise, deep, and linear, completely inconsistent with animal scratches or bites. The question that had lingered for over a decade: what made it? In 1999, Delaware forensics lacked the tools to analyze the cut at a microscopic level. But in 2010, Elena ordered the lab to use a scanning electron microscope, (CM), and perform kerf analysis, the same forensic technique routinely used in modern homicide cases. The results made the entire team jump out of their seats. The cut was consistent with a small handheld utility saw, the exact type of multi-purpose saw Duncan had been documented using in various technical jobs in the past. The depth of the cut, the spacing of the parallel striations, and the angle of the cut surface all matched the tool group from the manufacturer Duncan was known to buy from. Specifically, parallel microstriations spaced 0.43 mm apart, depth of 1.2, 1.4 mm. Characteristic bone flaring, pushed to one side, classic signature of a fine-toothed steel blade, the kind commonly sold in portable home repair toolkits. Elena immediately asked the FBI to pull Duncan's purchase history from bank records, old receipts, and data from the small hardware stores he frequented in the 1990s. The archived records were fragmented, but after a week the FBI found the key item. In 1998, just 3 months before Sammy and Carmen disappeared, Duncan purchased a utility saw kit containing multiple small blades at a hardware store in Spokane, Washington. The invoice noted the kit included fine-tooth blade, thin steel blade, blade designed for cutting plastic and soft wood. The fine-tooth blade in that kit produced the closest match to the cut pattern on the Delaware victim's bones. Although the actual tool kit could not be recovered, Duncan had moved across multiple states and constantly replaced his gear. Forensic experts could still conclude the cut was made by the type of saw blade Duncan had purchased and regularly used, and it did not match any tool recovered from the dump site. Next, Elena examined whether the cut could have occurred before the bodies were dumped or after death. The new examination revealed microfracture feathering along the edges, proof the cut was made while the bone still had biological elasticity, meaning before full decomposition. This ruled out the possibility of an animal's tooth or later forestry equipment. After feeding the cut into the overall model, Elena tried to answer the critical question: what did this cut mean in the perpetrator's behavior? The FBI's BAU noted that Duncan typically carried tools in his vehicle, habitually used tools to cut objects when needed, and had repeatedly cleaned up victims in a similar pattern in other cases. Although it could not be proven that the Delaware cut was a deliberate dismemberment attempt, the pattern still fit Duncan's later habits. When the three pieces were put together, a complete picture emerged. The red fabric scrap belonged to a nylon acrylic jacket identical to the kind Duncan routinely wore. The forest dump site identical to Duncan's disposal pattern. The bone cut matched the exact tool Duncan had bought and used. Elena wrote in her case report, Not a single detail from the Delaware scene contradicts Duncan's behavior or tools. On the contrary, every element aligns to a degree that cannot reasonably be explained as coincidence. When the FBI ran all the physical evidence from both the 1997 Seattle case and the 1998 Delaware case through federal pattern analysis software, the match rose from 92% behavioral to 95%, with the added forensic factors, especially the bone cut. This marked the first major forensic breakthrough in the Sammy and Carmen case since 1998. Elena reported the results to her cold case unit supervisor, and the report went straight to FBI headquarters. In her official conclusion, she wrote, "The red fabric, the disposal location, and the bone cut all converge on a single suspect, Joseph Edward Duncan III. For the first time in over 12 years, forensics, behavior, and physical evidence all pointed in the same direction, and no alternate suspect could fit the offender profile." The 1998 Delaware case finally had the breakthrough needed to move into the federal indictment phase. After the forensic breakthrough linking the bone cut to a tool Duncan had used, Delaware and the FBI agreed the next step had to be direct contact with Joseph Edward Duncan III, who was then serving multiple life sentences in a supermax prison in Idaho for other crimes. The goal was not to obtain a direct confession, but to test whether he would reveal details that matched the 1998 Delaware case, details only the true perpetrator could know. Detective Elena Mercer was sent to Idaho to lead the interview. Before leaving, she and the cold case unit prepared a two-tiered question list: broad questions to gauge reactions, carefully planted questions to test insider knowledge of the Delaware scene. In the interview room, Duncan appeared calm, almost detached, studying Elena more than the files. He was notorious for manipulating interviewers, so Elena did not open with the Delaware case. Instead, she talked about the years he traveled between 1996 and 1999, especially his stays at cheap motels across the country. Duncan gave a faint smile. "Those places, nobody pays attention to anybody. Easy to blend in." That statement chillingly matched the behavioral profile the FBI had outlined in the earlier part. Elena pushed further, asking about times he had stopped on the East Coast. Duncan paused for a few seconds, a short but meaningful hesitation. He answered, "I was in Delaware once or twice, just passing through." That was a detail he volunteered, and it matched exactly what Delaware investigators had uncovered through lodging records and traffic stop logs in the previous part. Elena kept her expression neutral, giving no sign she already knew. She shifted to the nylon, acrylic jacket, the source of the red fabric scrap. "You used to wear nylon, acrylic jackets, right?" Duncan nodded, without hesitation. "Light, practical. They tear easily if someone grabs or yanks hard." That was precisely the forensic description of the red fabric recovered in Blackbird State Forest, and the same characteristic that matched the 1997 Seattle case. When Elena mentioned cases involving children at motels, Duncan showed little reaction. But when she said, "There were cases where bodies were found in the woods, and there were clean cuts on the bones," Duncan immediately tilted his head, the corner of his mouth twitching. He clearly recognized the detail. Most crucially, the bone cut had never been released to the public. No media outlet had ever mentioned it. If Duncan reacted, he knew it from only one possible source: his own actions. Elena pressed further, "The tool that made the cut, similar to the kind you used on jobs." Duncan answered without pause, "I always carried tools, even when I wasn't fixing anything." Not a confession, but an admission of the exact habit Delaware forensics had uncovered. The cut matched a small saw blade, the type Duncan bought 3 months before the Delaware crime. For final confirmation, Elena asked a question that could not be guessed because it was based on internal forensic findings. If there were 2 children's bodies, why might they be found dozens of yards apart? Duncan answered instantly, "Animals could drag the bones, or someone didn't want them lying together." Those were the exact 2 official conclusions from Delaware forensics. never made public. An innocent person could not know them. Though Duncan never said "I did it," the interview showed he knew far too many details that matched the investigation. He admitted being in Delaware. He described the exact jacket that produced the red fabric. He reacted instantly to the unreleased bone-cut detail. He gave the precise forensic explanations for the body separation, and he admitted carrying the type of tool that made the cut. As Elena ended the interview, Duncan left her with one cryptic line: "Some things I say, some things I let people figure out for themselves." Not a confession, but not a denial either. It was classic Duncan, a form of indirect admission, leaving just enough space for investigators to connect the dots. When Elena left the Idaho prison, she knew she didn't have a signed confession, but she had something more valuable: perfect alignment between what Duncan said and details only the real killer could know. Duncan had not confessed, but to Elena, his silence and half-answers only reinforced one thing: he had been in Delaware in 1998, and he had carried that secret for over a decade. After the Idaho prison session, Detective Elena Mercer returned to Delaware with a single clear goal: reconstruct the exact route the perpetrator took the night. Sammy and Carmen vanished from the Liberty Inn to Blackbird State Forest. This was not just a technical exercise. It would corroborate Duncan's indirect statements and reactions from the previous part, and most importantly, confirm whether the actual behavior fit the time, location constraints already established. Elena's first step was to build a master timeline from every piece of data: security cameras, witness statements, motel receipts, traffic stop logs, and the Idaho interview. The critical data points were: Sammy and Carmen left their room around 9:44 p.m. A large dark vehicle passed a traffic camera at 9:47 p.m. A complete data gap from 10 p.m., 11:15 p.m., with no camera capturing a matching license plate. Distance from Liberty Inn to Blackbird State Forest, 37-42 minutes depending on route. If the perpetrator took the children straight from the motel toward Blackbird, he could arrive before 10:30 p.m., perfectly within the disappearance window. To verify, Elena used 1998 maps combined with modern GIS software to recreate the original routes. While a few minor roads had changed, the major network remained the same. She mapped three primary routes: Route 1, US 13 South Blackbird Flat, easy, few traffic lights, time 38 minutes. Advantage: fastest, ideal for someone wanting to leave the area quickly. Disadvantage: some traffic cameras, though poor quality in 1998. Route 2, detour onto Kirkwood Highway, rural row Blackbird, time 45-47 minutes. Advantage: low visibility, sparse population, farm roads. Disadvantage: winding, harder at night. Route 3, long loop, via St. George's Bridge, small forest roads, time 55 minutes. Advantage: avoids major traffic entirely. Disadvantage: too long for the available window. Elena immediately ruled out Route 3. It did not fit Duncan's time constraints. She focused on routes 1 and 2. Next, she needed to confirm whether Duncan's vehicle could navigate both routes smoothly. From the previous part records, Duncan was driving a dark-colored minivan registered in Washington state. That type of van, moderate ground clearance, quiet on highways, perfectly capable on the dirt roads into Blackbird. Delaware's forensic reconstruction team conducted live timed runs using a nearly identical minivan. They started from the Liberty Inn at 9:45 p.m. and drove both routes. Results: Route 139 minutes, almost exactly as predicted. Route 2 47 minutes, if no stops. These times fit perfectly inside the 10 p.m., 11:15 p.m. camera data gap, the exact window the perpetrator could have left the scene, disposed of the bodies, and rejoined normal traffic. To pinpoint likely stopping points, the team expanded radar mapping inside Blackbird State Forest. The 1999 search had noted the remains were in a raised, heavily treed area, 650 meters off the main dirt road. There were no tire tracks near the dump site, indicating the perpetrator parked on the main road and carried or dragged the victims deeper into the woods. Elena cross-referenced this with Duncan's Idaho statement, "Animals move things," or "someone didn't want them together." That was exactly the forensic conclusion for the separation distance between the two sets of remains. With no deep tire tracks, the most likely scenario was the perpetrator carried each child individually and placed them at separate spots near the forest access point, behavior Duncan was physically capable of in 1998. When analyzing the route further, Elena asked would Duncan even know how to get to Blackbird State Forest. The answer was in the Route 13 traffic stop log. Duncan had once been pulled over only 12 miles from Blackbird. That proved he had driven the exact corridor to the dump site, and could not claim unfamiliarity with the area. For maximum precision, Elena built the tightest possible timeline, 9:44 p.m., 9:47 p.m. Sammy and Carmen leave room, approach placed in vehicle. Traffic camera captures dark minivan, 9:50 p.m., 10:30 p.m. Minivan travels US 13 south, turns into Blackbird. No cameras record the vehicle during this window. 10:30 p.m., 10:50 p.m. Stops on Forest Dirt Road, carries victims into woods, disposes. 11:15 p.m., 11:15 p.m. Vehicle returns to highway, blends with normal traffic. This timeline matched perfectly with the camera data gap, minivan capabilities, the disappearance timeline, body distribution, and the travel behavior Duncan indirectly described in prison. Finally, Elena fed the entire model into 3D reconstruction software and compared it to Duncan's known prior crimes. The results were undeniable: route, travel time, stop-and-go pattern, concealment level, and dump site selection matched between 88% and 96% with Duncan's established movement patterns in other cases. There was no longer any doubt he was the only individual capable of executing the entire sequence from Liberty Inn to Blackbird State Forest within the case's time frame. Cross-referencing every timeline, location, camera record, behavioral profile, and forensic analysis, Elena concluded in her report, the 1998 Delaware offender route matches perfectly with Joseph Edward Duncan III's movement capability, habits, and documented presence. No other suspect fits this model. The route reconstruction was complete, and it was the final critical piece needed to move to formal charges. After reconstructing the crime route, and proving that Duncan was the only person capable of leaving the Liberty Inn between 9:44, 9:50 p.m. and appearing at Blackbird State Forest around 10:20, 10:30 p.m., Detective Elena Mercer began the final step in the cold case process, eliminating all remaining suspects using modern forensics, location data, and behavioral analysis. In 1998, the suspect list contained 14 individuals, people who had been near the Liberty Inn, owned vehicles matching the description, or had prior offenses involving child assault. But the 1998 files lacked DNA, the surveillance footage was blurry, and physical evidence was fragmented. As a result, many remained in the possible category. In 2010, using new forensic technology, Elena re-examined every one of them. The first breakthrough came from textile evidence: a red nylon, acrylic fabric fragment, and dark green polyester fibers. None of the remaining 13 suspects had ever owned the cheap nylon, acrylic jacket with its distinctive twisted yarn weave. None had textile material that matched the dark green polyester fibers. Only Duncan had worn that exact type of jacket, something he indirectly described during his Idaho interrogation when he said a nylon jacket tears easily if grabbed hard, which perfectly matched the tear pattern on the fragment recovered at the scene. Next, forensics eliminated suspects based on tool marks, The cuts on the Delaware victim's bones matched exactly the fine-tooth saw blade from the toolkit Duncan purchased 3 months before the crime. No other suspect owned or had ever used a tool with a matching kerf pattern. Using SAM analysis and standard kerf measurement, experts concluded that only the blade Duncan owned could produce the parallel 0.43 mm striations and one-sided bone beveling seen on the victims. This was extremely strong scientific evidence that ruled out every other suspect. Turning to location, timeline data, Elena cross-referenced receipts, time clock records, hospital logs, restored traffic camera footage, and witness statements. 7 suspects were in other states on the night of the crime. 3 were on night shifts and proven to be at work. 2 lived too far from Claymont to appear at the Liberty Inn at 9:44 p.m. 1 was recorded by a gas station camera at 9:50 p.m. After the killer had already left the scene, Duncan, by contrast, was the only person with 3 direct matches. He rented a room in Wilmington the week of the abductions. His vehicle matched the shadow in the Liberty Inn footage and the Philadelphia Pike traffic camera, and he was stopped on Route 13, near Blackbird just 12 days after the disappearance. Elena continued the elimination with behavioral analysis. The behavioral analysis unit compared all 14 suspect profiles against the Delaware offender signature, targeting children, fast attacks, approaching victims at cheap motels, dumping bodies in forests near highways, crossing state lines, leaving clothing evidence behind, and habitually carrying tools. The other 13 suspects did not fit, some only offended against adults, some were loud and left obvious scenes, many lacked the strength to carry victims into the woods, and none had a history of interstate travel. Duncan alone matched 92% of the signature, a near-perfect fit. Elena also tested the crime route for each suspect. 5 did not own vehicles powerful enough for the Blackbird Forest roads. 4 had travel patterns that did not match the reconstruction. 3 had no reason to be on Route 13 that night. 1 had a rock-solid alibi. When compared to Duncan, every factor aligned: timing, route, vehicle, mobility, and behavioral profile. The final key element was Duncan's reaction during the Idaho interrogation. When asked about the bone cuts, the distance between the 2 bodies, the forest dump site, and the nylon, acrylic jacket, Duncan reacted strongly, accurately answered 2 undisclosed forensic hypotheses, and even volunteered that he had visited Delaware once or twice. No other suspect reacted that way. Most didn't even know where the bodies were found. The details Duncan unconsciously revealed matched classified case facts that only the killer could know. When Elena compiled everything, the final report was unmistakable, based on modern forensics, location data, route reconstruction, textile evidence, behavioral analysis, and suspect reactions. 13 of the 14 original suspects were absolutely excluded. Only one individual satisfied every piece of data: Joseph Edward Duncan III. In her conclusion to the FBI, Elena wrote, "There is no longer any other possibility. The entire forensic behavioral, route physical evidence model converges on a single suspect, Duncan." The 1998 Delaware case had finally shed all noise and was ready for official closure. After completing the elimination of all 13 remaining suspects and proving that Joseph Edward Duncan III was the only individual who satisfied every forensic behavioral and route data point, the Delaware State Police finally reached the moment they had waited nearly 25 years for: the official announcement that the Sammy White and Carmen Alvarez case was solved. The decision was made only after weeks of rechecking, cross-verification, and retesting every new forensic result to ensure every claim was airtight and left no room for doubt. At the press conference held at Delaware State Police headquarters in Dover, the spokesperson began with a short but momentous statement: "The person responsible for the 1998 abduction and murder of 2 little girls has been identified. That individual is Joseph Edward Duncan III." The room fell silent. Many reporters, retired investigators, and especially the victims' families, who had been waiting for answers since 1998, bowed their heads. For them, this was not just a legal announcement. It was the end of a long, painful chapter. Police then presented the detailed scientific and investigative grounds for the conclusion, emphasizing that it was not Duncan's statements, but forensics and behavioral analysis, that forced his name to the top as the sole perpetrator. First was bone forensics and textile evidence. Experts explained that the clean cuts on the victim's bones, once dismissed as unimportant, in 1999, now under SEM and kerf analysis, matched 100% the fine-tooth saw blade Duncan bought 3 months before the crime. Next, the red nylon, acrylic fragment and dark green polyester fibers from the Blackbird State Forest dump site, matched the jacket Duncan owned, and were consistent with evidence from the 1997 Seattle case, in which he had been a person of interest. Crucially, none of the other 13 suspects matched any textile evidence. Only Duncan matched everything. Next, police presented the location timeline data. Restored traffic camera footage showed a blurry license plate, whose first 4 characters matched Duncan's 1998 minivan. Hotel records proved Duncan stayed in Wilmington, the exact week the girls vanished. A Route 13 traffic stop log confirmed he was near Blackbird just 12 days later. No one else on the 1998 suspect list had a matching timeline. Most had alibis or were in other states. The most striking part of the press conference was the crime route reconstruction, the result of months of 3D modeling and real-world testing with similar vehicles. Police showed that the killer left the motel between 9:47, 9:50 p.m., took US 13 south, and arrived at Blackbird around 10:20, 10:30 p.m., perfectly filling the camera gap from 10 o'clock, 11:15 p.m., when the bodies were carried into the woods. Duncan was the only person present in the area with the right vehicle and an exact timeline match. Finally, the lead investigator presented the behavioral analysis and Duncan's reactions during the Idaho interrogation. Though he never confessed, his responses to undisclosed details, the bone cuts, the jacket tear characteristics, the exact placement of the bodies, showed he knew things only the killer could know. The BAU rated Duncan's behavioral match to the Delaware offender at 92%, rising to 95% when forensics were added. No other suspect scored above 30%. After laying out the 4 pillars of evidence, police explained why the case took nearly 25 years. First, 1998 forensics were extremely limited. No DNA, no recoverable plates, textile evidence ignored because it didn't belong to the victims. Second, Duncan was a transient interstate offender who avoided credit cards and fixed addresses, so he never appeared on the original 1998 suspect list. Third, the critical technologies that ultimately solved the case, blurred plate recovery, kerf analysis, synthetic fiber identification, and 3D route reconstruction, simply did not exist when the girls disappeared. The case was not mishandled. Science in 1998 simply wasn't ready. At the end of the press conference, the Delaware State Police declared, based on forensics location data, textile evidence, route reconstruction, and behavioral analysis, the state of Delaware confirms that Joseph Edward Duncan III is the perpetrator in the 1998 abduction and murder of Sammy White and Carmen Alvarez. The victims' families left the room in silence, not because the tragedy had faded, but because the truth they had waited 25 years for had finally arrived. The case was no longer a mystery. With that statement, Delaware officially closed one of the most heartbreaking cold cases in state history. When the Delaware State Police officially closed file #128C, with the final conclusion that Joseph Edward Duncan III was the sole perpetrator in the 1998 disappearance and murder of 2 little girls. Every investigator who had worked on the 12-year revival effort looked back and asked, what turned a seemingly unsolvable case into one that was peeled open, layer by layer, from fragments that once seemed meaningless? The answer lies in three core operational pillars: tiny physical evidence, 21st century forensic technology, and the value of re-examining old files. The biggest lesson: every piece of evidence, no matter how insignificant it appears at collection, has potential value. In this case, the red nylon, acrylic fragment, once labeled "seen trash" because it contained no DNA and didn't belong to the victims, became the linchpin of the entire investigation. In 1998, there was no way to analyze weave patterns, tear characteristics, or trace material origin. But when technology advanced, that same fragment suddenly connected Delaware 1998 to Seattle 1997, enabled cross-state comparison, and pointed straight to Duncan. Had that piece been discarded or removed from the file as irrelevant, the case would never have been solved. This is now a foundational principle for the Delaware Cold Case Unit. No evidence is too small to preserve. The second lesson belongs to 21st century forensic science. The case did not drag on for 25 years because of initial investigative errors, but because the technology of the time could not yet interpret what the crime scene left behind. Only when scanning electron microscopy, kerf analysis, blurred plate enhancement software, and synthetic fiber databases matured, did the traces start to speak. The bone cuts, unanalyzable in 1999, ultimately matched exactly the saw blade Duncan bought and used on his cross-country trip. Traffic camera images, once useless because they were too blurry, were enhanced enough to reveal 4 license plate characters, proving Duncan was in Claymont the moment the girls vanished. Modern forensics didn't just find answers, it rewrote what old science had overlooked, turning scattered fragments into legally weighty proof. The third, and the reason Delaware reopened the file at all, is the immense value of reviewing old cases with fresh eyes. Many cases are solved only when a later investigator asks different questions than the original team. Elena Mercer's decision to reread file #128C from page 1, every note, every item of evidence, revived details no one had noticed for nearly 2 decades: the tear pattern on the red fabric, the offset placement of the bodies, the 9:47, 10:15 p.m. camera gap, and Duncan's seemingly random but highly suggestive appearances on interstate routes. No modern technology works if the old file gathers dust. Rewalking every step, with new tools and new perspective, is what brings a cold case back to life. At the end of the internal debrief, the cold case unit supervisor wrote one line in the closure report: "The case was solved by recognizing value in the smallest details, and by never giving up when science didn't yet have the answers." The day file #128C was closed marked not just the end of a 25-year hunt for a killer, but became a model lesson for every investigative unit. A seemingly impossible case can be revived by a single piece of cloth, a blurry license plate character, or an offhand remark in an interrogation. That is the true meaning of cold case work: persistence, meticulousness, and faith in the power of details that once seemed meaningless. The story of Sammy and Carmen, in Delaware in 1998, is not only a criminal tragedy that lasted nearly 25 years, it is also a sobering reminder of dangers that still exist in modern American life. Especially when child safety is involved in time windows we often think it's only a minute or two. In this case, the girls left their room for just a few minutes to buy snacks in the Liberty Inn hallway, and that tiny gap was all a predator needed. Today, even with more cameras, greater surveillance, and better societal awareness of child safety, those just 1-2 minutes moments remain a vulnerability criminals can exploit, especially at budget motels, parking lots, gas stations, or neighborhoods near interstate highways. Another detail: the red fabric fragment dismissed in 1998, but that became the key more than a decade later, shows that everything small can hold big meaning, both in investigations and in everyday life. Sometimes the little anomalies, a stranger watching your child too closely in a store, a car parked oddly near a playground, or anything that simply doesn't feel right, are worth noticing and acting on. Detective Elena's relentless re-examination of old files, refusing to accept what previous investigators labeled unimportant, reminds us that persistence and asking new questions can change outcomes in any field, from work to family relationships. Finally, the story underscores that community safety depends not only on police or technology, but on attention, responsibility, and willingness to report anything unusual. In today's world, sometimes all it takes is one person willing to speak up, like the Denny's employee in this story, to save a life. If you want to keep following cold cases solved through science and unrelenting effort like this one, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video with an investigation journey that has even more surprises.